It's so good to see you. I know we've just had a little bit of a check-in, and yeah, first I want to just share how fun it is to have this oak tree behind you. And I thought maybe you could speak, Mark, to a little bit about how that tree joins you every day for your meditation teachings.
Oh, yeah. So this oak is by the side of my house. I'm in Sausalito in California, which is unceded Miwok land. And yeah, so when COVID started, I started to lead a daily nature sit because I figured a lot of people were locked down, sheltering in place, couldn't get outside, couldn't get into nature. And I live, relatively close to nature. And so I would this window is my office window. I hop out the window onto my the roof of an add-on to the house, and I sit under the grace under the boughs of this beautiful oak tree, and started teaching that class as a sunrise meditation. Started for a week, and then it became 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks, and then COVID started to drag on, and it was a month, and then it became a year, and then it's still going. It's now almost 18 months or longer, and the class is still going. So I have a very fond relationship with that oak tree and the crows and the birds that nest there and the squirrels that run up and down, and so it's been a great
Oh,
companion and guardian through this time.
it's so lovely. And that you were able to bring that to other people because you're right, there was such a lockdown and like people weren't able to get outside. So I love how it's kept momentum.
Yes, me
That's
too.
wonderful.
Me
Yeah.
too. It's yeah, going strong. I didn't think it would, and people just hungry, and also, Zoom allows people to tune in from anywhere, any time zone. So we've had people from China and Colombia and the Arctic Circle and Russia and India and Europe a lot, and my family in England, and it's been very sweet.
That is so
Sweet.
sweet.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is I just love what you're doing in the world. And as I'm launching this body of work, Power Reclamation, I'm wanting to talk with more people that are really in this devotion to helping others return to who they really are, like return to our essential self.
Mm.
And I know you do that so beautifully through your work. But the thing that's so inspiring to me about what you do is your love for nature and how you are integrating that as a deep portal to actually this returning home, this presence of being. So, here's what I'd love for you to start with, because I have been wanting to go on your nature retreat, the one to with the whales. I think it's in
Oh, in
Baja.
Baja. Hmm.
Yeah. And I remember reading one of your blogs, and you were talking about being in the kayaks and the whale coming, and like the contact with the eye. And I wonder if
Mm.
we could start there, and then
Mm.
I have some questions for you about your work and
Mm.
the connection.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's true. I lead these kayaking meditation retreats down in Baja with a dear friend of mine. Have been for the last probably dozen years or so. And there's two things happen. So one is we take a trip to the west coast, to the Pacific side, and we go out in a boat, small boat, and go visit the gray whales who are calving. And so we pull up alongside the young calves, and the mother sort of patiently waits while the calf is young, very curious, comes up to the boat and plays. And yeah, and you have this very intimate contact, this eye to eye contact with this baby who's already, I think, 10 tons or something like that. They're quite huge beings and very innocent. And it's profound having that intimate contact with a wild being like that. And then when we're kayaking in the Sea of Cortez, we're in the national park. So there's lots of, there's been a resurgence of the blue whales coming back, and finback whales and humpback whales. And several times we've had very close encounters. We had one, there's one year where a finback whale, which are the second largest whales, can be up to 100 tons, I think, we often do a floating meditation out in these beautiful seas, and then we just wait and we hear the whales blowing. And this one time, this finback whale surfaced on we were in a group in a cluster, and this finback whale just surfaced very slowly to the side of us, and then went down, dove, and came up the other side. Just would sort of play around us for a long time, and very curious and very seemingly engaged and connecting, and so it's profound, being out, of course, being vulnerable in a little, plastic floating thing, and these beautiful ocean worthy mammals, that are, old and huge, and yet very delicate and sensitive. And so it's like with contact with any wild being in nature, it's very moving. It's very it's like a communication across species, and of course we're mindful, we're silent, we're meditating, so there's a lot of openness and receptivity, and so that the impact of that is felt much more deeply.
I would imagine so, just because there's less noise happening, where there's more receptivity to feeling and sensing another being, whether
Right.
it's a human or another animal.
Right.
And I've had the privilege of like swimming with wild dolphins, but also being
Mm.
in the ocean with a whale and her calf.
Mm.
And I had that eye contact at one point.
Mm.
And I remember literally I felt like something in my brain changed. There was something about the recognition and the connection of being with another mammal that has such a high intelligence and communicates, differently than we do, but is
Mm.
really bringing this medicine of connectedness in a way that I think my heart really needed. I think
Right.
sometimes for me, I struggle with humanity, and I struggle with my ways of feeling aligned with a lot of parts of being a human.
Mhm.
So, can you speak a little bit about, this is a big question, I guess, but you teach around, your book is called Awake in the Wild.
Mhm.
And then you have programs and teacher trainings, which we'll get to later. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey of getting to following the path of meditation and then bringing in the nature component, and why that's so important
Hmm.
for you.
Mhm. Yeah, well, been meditating a while. I started in the 80s in London, actually, as far away from wilderness. I was in east end of London, which at the time was very, urban. It still is depressed, grey, concrete, and even though I grew up in northern England, I was sort of on the edge of farmland and the coast, and so I had a lot of access to nature when I was growing up as a kid. Not in the wilderness, but a lot of immersion in forests and the sea, and so definitely that early conditioning, which I think is really important for kids to have that access to nature, definitely seeds something. And then I went to London, and I was at college and learned meditation there, and was in London for many years, but was always desperate to get out at the weekends to the parks or to nature somewhere. And then I went to Asia to study meditation some more. And then in the early 90s, I came to the East Coast, to the States, and got a camper van, drove around the country, fell in love with the wilderness, especially in the Rockies and the mountains, and just the vastness of the wild landscapes here, in the deserts in the Southwest, and then coming up the Sierras, and it really opened my eyes to this whole different world of nature that's really untamed. There's beautiful nature in England and Europe, but it's mostly cultivated, mostly habitated. And there's just so much wilderness here that you can lose yourself in. And so what happened is I started, because I was living more in nature or close to nature, I naturally take my meditation practice outside in the garden or on a hike or camping or backpacking. And it just felt so natural. Like, why would I want to sit inside with the sound of the humming refrigerator or my neighbor's music or the car next door revving, whatever it is, and just be outside with the wind and the smells and the insects and the bird song and the life and the color. And so it just became very obvious to me that was a great support for mindfulness practice. And then I started doing my own retreats outside, whether it was camping or backpacking, and one of the things that was obvious to me was it was a lot easier to be present, because nature lures our attention. There's so much going on: the sounds, the sights, the smells, the breeze, the colors, the diversity. and then it's also more joyful. Like there's so much gladdening the heart, so much beauty, so much delight, so much spaciousness, expansiveness. And so it was very uplifting, and joyful. And so that was like my practice for a long time. And then I started teaching. I trained in the insight meditation tradition, and then trained with various teachers, including Jack Kornfield and others, and started teaching in the insight vipassana world, which was great. And then a few years into that teaching, I was invited to lead a wilderness retreat in Navajo country, in the canyons, in beautiful red rock, very silent canyons. And so I did that, and I just fell in love with the profundity of the silence and the stillness and the beauty and the mystery and the ancientness of these millions of year old rocks, and away from people and disturbances and pollution, and I just was like, that was it. It's like, okay, well, this is what I wanted to devote my life to. And so after that, I said, okay, I'm open to any and all invitations from nature retreats. So whether it was, I do kayaking up in Alaska, or backpacking in the Sierras, or retreats in the desert, and just began to sort of integrate. Like I do rafting down the Green River in Utah, and just kind of playing with, well, what forms work, what environments work. And each environment, of course, has its own gift and teaching and beauty, whether it's the desert or the mountains or the forest or the ocean. And so it was just playing with these different forms and different environments, and just seeing how each one had its own gift, its own mystery and blessing. And so I've been doing that, almost for the last 20 years, leading retreats, mostly in the western states, Arizona, New Mexico, California, down in Baja, sometimes Alaska, sometimes further afield like Europe or Peru or Australia. And just, really the idea was to introduce people to what I'd been experiencing, which was this lovely integration of mindfulness and this contemplative presence in nature, and how really nature is the primal teacher, and I see my work as a facilitator to help people work with their own minds and bodies, so they can be really present and really open and receptive, and receive the wisdom and the beauty of nature. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the more recent you mentioned it, like 7 or 8 years, I've been running teacher trainings, guiding people in how to offer that work, because I feel like it's, especially as the ecological crisis deepens, I want to encourage as many people as possible to go outside, to bring that presence into nature, to let it transform us and touch us and heal us.
Yeah. Well, that makes me want to ask a further question on your statement a minute ago, which is nature is a primal, did you say a primal healer? Teacher.
A teacher and healer, yeah.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, I think of the, indigenous cultures and where there wasn't that separation from nature, but there was also the understanding of everything in nature being, having presence or spirit or the divine or the sacred. And one of the things coming from the Buddhist tradition that I had, where there's beautiful array of wisdom teachings about life and the mind and nature and human nature and the laws that govern this world, and that when you go outside, all those wisdom teachings that are really pretty common across most traditions, the truth of interconnectedness and interdependence, and the reality of impermanence and change and transience and letting go. They're all just, it's so obvious in nature. You go into a forest, and to reflect on interdependence, right? Of course, the trees are connected to the humus and the soil and the biology of the soil and the elements and the pollinating insects. Like, it's just so alive and it's just so obvious. And so so when we get quiet enough, and this is where the integration of mindfulness and the nature practice is so helpful, because with mindfulness practice, we train the mind to be present, to be aware, to be receptive, to be embodied. And so with that awareness, then we can, listen more deeply and quietly to nature and whatever teaching it's given, which is multiple in any moment. And each person will have their own doorway and their own teaching from that. So I feel like we're just tapping into this ancient knowledge, whether it's indigenous traditions, or even in the most spiritual traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, yogis, went to the caves and the mountains and the deserts and meditated, because that was they didn't have nice air conditioned buildings. It was just, the Buddha would say, go to a tree, the root of a tree, and meditate, right, and then it's like a lot of that wisdom gets revealed.
That's so true. I know when I think about my greatest teacher, I mean, I've had a lot of amazing teachers in the spiritual realm, but it has been nature reflecting back parts of myself that I couldn't see. And you said it already, but I want to underscore it. The way that it opens my heart is like nothing else. The joy of watching a hummingbird or a tiny little beetle, like making its way across, there's just something shifting from this busy doing, like superhuman compulsion that our culture, kind of encourages, to actually being present. There's a perception from the mind that there's going to be a lot of boredom. And I think there can be, like we can get that, the mind can take over and create an experience of that. But I think maybe you could speak a little bit more about this quality of, why does it make a difference to be present? How does that shift our mind? And particularly the thing around the senses, because you mentioned that. So maybe you could tie that in of why that's such an essential piece.
Yeah. Well, what's lovely about being in nature, so the word that I use is allure. Nature allures our attention, right? Often people associate meditation and mindfulness as kind of like it's work, it's hard, you have to fight with your mind and you get distracted and it's effort, and that's all true. Meditation is a mind training. And yet when we go out into nature, for the most part, we don't have to like when you go for a hike or you sit by the ocean, you don't have to struggle to pay attention. This is no, you want to look at the waves and the pelicans floating by and the clouds billowing and the colors in the sand, and it's our circuitry, sensory circuitry is naturally attuned to the natural world and all of its complexity, and so really we just have to take ourselves out into nature, and in some ways nature does a lot of the work in that it pulls forth our attention. It pulls forth our curiosity, right? We hear a sound or a variety of symphony of sounds of birds, and it kind of quickens our attention. Or we see something moving in the bushes, and it's like, is it what is it? Is it a creature? Is it threatening? Is it or we see it we were talking about being in Colorado and New Mexico this year with the wonderful monsoon rains that's been there, and so the carpets of wildflowers, and it's just riveting, and so it doesn't take any effort to be present and be curious, and then of course that presence allows us to connect with the natural world. And when we connect with it, often what we find is we feel love, we feel awe, we feel wonder, we feel this whole host of wonderful qualities: joy, delight, rapture, openness, beauty, and it's just this wonderful thing. And so that and of course, if you've done a little bit of mind training or have some awareness of mindfulness, then that it's very easy to get distracted, and so you notice that, and then you come back and you rather than thinking about planting all those flowers that you're seeing back home in your garden, you're like, okay, well that's a good idea, but let's be present to the beauty that's here right now, to the lupins and the trumpet vines and whatever else is revealing itself. And so I think of the work that I do, it's sort of an alchemy of awareness and the natural world, and out of that comes these beautiful qualities of love and joy and wonder, and care, and then also wisdom. I mean, there's a lot of learning that comes from that sort of synthesis.
So beautiful, the description. So I just started welling up with tears, because when you were talking about love and the way that the nature can create this experience of love, I think about the healing that I've done with my own trauma and my own journey with that, and how sometimes just going and laying in a river will completely transform my state, and I will literally feel held by love. And I think that on the cushion, I work so much with my mind, and that's been really important, like a really important part of the journey, and always will be, because there's something about just like resting back into awareness that I'm on the cushion. But I have found being in nature it's a different facet of embodiment for me. And I think you're speaking to it, where I'm experiencing a quality of love that's so reparative to my human experience, whether it's like feeling held in the river, or just leaning up against a tree. And, you know, it could sound really woo-woo. Like if I talk with some of my corporate clients about this, it's like, oh, a tree hugger from Boulder. And in a way, yeah. And I might have even had those judgments before, because I wouldn't have gotten the somatic, actual grounding that this kind of love is, that feels very pristine. And so could you say more about your experience with nature and eliciting love and awakening this in you?
Yeah, so much. I think, I was just, I was up in the foothills last weekend, and I took a walk in this park. It's called Calaveras Big Tree State Park, and it's a small grove of ancient sequoia trees. And so, you hike a few miles into these woods, and you come across these, I mean, literally 2,000-3,000 year old trees that are like, I mean, I walked around the base of one tree. It was 100 feet around the base, which is probably like the base. It's probably like the size of the room that you're in. I mean, it was just immense, and just obviously been there for thousands of years. And we feel, we feel something in the presence of those things, those beings, whether it's stillness or strength or power or presence, because it's been there, longer than most civilization, that we, and so in terms of the love, I think when I go out into nature, and I think it's true for many people, as you were speaking, that we feel, and I feel a sense of unconditional acceptance. Like I feel accepted, I feel welcomed, I feel held, I feel not judged, and safe, and so it's really we enter into a relationship, right? And so there's something I've been exploring a lot these last few years, that when I go into the woods, right, we often go, well, I walked the woods, I did the woods, or we use these kind of words that are very sort of acquisitive,
Industrial Revolution like.
Right. And what's really true is we enter into a relationship. We are always in relationship with everything that we're around. And so in that moment, as we enter the woods, we become part of the woods. We are part of the forest. We just happen to be mobile and have different senses and not necessarily located there, but we are there temporarily. And the birds and the trees and insects, in that moment, we're just another part of the forest. And so I think that's an important part of what happens in the heart as it becomes more sensitive, and we realize we are in relationship. And one of the things that arises out of that relationship is also the love that grows in our own heart. I think it's a reciprocal feeling of both being held, like you talked about, in the river or behind a rock. But also, what I find is I just feel tremendous love, like for the trees or the rocks or the insects or the birds or whatever it is. It just pours out of me. It just I'm not trying to be loving. It just, like, how could I not love beauty and vulnerability and majesty, and so it's a beautiful thing to let ourselves be touched and opened, and of course, as we love, then we tend to care more about those things, and when we care more about those things, we're more likely to protect them. And so I have this phrase that forms the basis of my work. It's, we protect what we love. And so I think of my work, my awakening, my work is helping people fall back in love with the earth, or fall more deeply in love with the earth, so they'll actually care for it more and steward it more and protect it more and rally for it more than before. So that's my closet mission, is to unleash throngs of earth-loving protectors, really, because what the earth needs right now is stewardship and protection and radical transformation of human society, so we can live sustainably. But I think if people don't have intimate contact with nature, it's just a concept. It's just like, oh yeah, right, the deserts are growing, and the oceans acidifying, and the corals bleaching, and it just doesn't mean anything unless you actually, like, when I walk in the forest now in Northern California where I live, I feel it's really sad. It's so bleak. It's so dry. The forests are so stressed. The ground feels dead. The creeks are dry, and forests are burning left, right, and center. You can't go anywhere in Northern California and not be smoked out to some degree. And so when we care, when we love, then we want to do something about that. We don't want to go to sleep, right? How can you go to sleep when something that you love is burning up? You want to do something. So I think that love kindles, hopefully, a force for action, engagement and responding.
Yeah. So you're just opening the doorway of where I really want to go next, which is, I've been navigating my own deep grief about what's happening on the planet with nature and with all the species. And I know that you're so deeply immersed in this world and becoming an activist for the earth. And I wonder if you could speak more, one, about how you're going about that, and then maybe we could talk about, well, I'll start there. Like, could you speak to your passion around how you're bringing more awareness to people so that they can fall in love, or that we can steward the earth?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very it's a complex issue, and it's difficult, partly because it's so massive, it's overwhelming, and it's and for many of us, it's hard to think about what's the best node of interception. Like, how do you make a difference? How do you engage? And there's lots of wonderful people and organizations and doing helping people respond to that. And I think for me, and I've done various kind of activism, grassroots. I've been remember in the days of old when the headwaters redwood forests were being cut down, there was huge demonstrations, and I'd be up there a lot. And so there's different ways we can engage. And I think as I've been teaching more, and one thing that's clear to me is just to be clear about knowing what one's calling is, or what one's gift is, or what one's skill set is, right? And you can't do everything. You can do one tiny little piece that's an expression of your care and your individuality. And so for me, and I think it involves a few things. One is it involves not going to sleep. So it means staying informed, paying attention, reading the hard news. And it's really painful to read the news and stay current to what's happening ecologically, because the data is pretty bleak. And then the second thing is for me, it's been reflecting on, well, what's my particular gift is, I'm trained in meditation, I've trained in teaching meditation, I've trained in taking people out into the woods. And that feels like my biggest gift. It's not saving an explicit forest per se, but I feel like the work that I do is helping people, deepen their connection to the earth, deepen their love of the earth, reflect on how they might be better stewards. So I kind of think of it as an indirect activism. And of course, one of the shifts that we know needs to happen is a radical shift in consciousness, particularly around how we feel separate, how we feel other than the earth, other than nature. And so when we go into nature with a contemplative presence, we can start to shed that sense of human hubris, separation, individualism, isolation, and othering. And I think that's an important shift that has to happen globally, but it also happens one person at a time. And then I talk about it, So 10 years ago, I talk about climate change, and when I was in the meditation room, the room would just glaze over it with this kind of numbness. And then 5 years ago, people start to pay a little more interest because the fires had started here, like really raising their ugly heads. And then now I talk about it, and people mostly want to hear about it because it is pressing in on us in every way. And so I think it's a duty for all of us, whatever role we're in, is to speak about it, to talk about it with our neighbors, with our friends, with our families who may have very different political perspectives. And also because I have a pulpit as a teacher, it's important for me to use that and to talk about, the reality of climate change. Not that people don't know about it, but also how does our spiritual practice relate to that? Because if it's not relating to that, then what's the point? If we're practicing for nirvana and the very place that we live in is not going to be, able to support life in a few decades, then what's the point? So that there has to be related. So I think there's some of the ways that I work. And at the same time, I struggle every day with wanting to do more and feeling like I'm not doing enough. And, I'm wanting to find land where I can grow more food and have a more intimate relationship with the earth, and try to do what I can to live simply and live lightly. I think that's important. But I think it's also important that we focus on the political systems and the economic systems that really are causing much of the damage, and to see what we can do to bring change there.
Yeah. That's where I find myself feeling the most despair, because when I talk about power reclamation, I talk about it self, other, and system. Mm-hmm. And when I think about the changes that are required, there's so much at a system level that it feels so far out of reach. At least that's the story I tell myself. So I think I appreciate what you're saying, because it's so massive that we have to be able to listen deeply to what we're called to do, in what way. And so coming back to you said, you do have an amazing platform where you actually can talk about this and bring more awareness to things. And so I wonder if you could share a couple of things with the listeners about what are some important things for people to be paying attention to in their daily lives, in connection with, what was your tagline again for?
We protect what we love.
Yeah. And then what was the next part about, there was the next line that I really loved. It was like being stewards. Mm-hmm. I can't remember, but we protect what we love. So could you, what would be a couple of things you would like to speak to around what you want people to know or think about?
Yeah. Well, so much, I think, so one of the things that I point people to, which is slightly paradoxical, is, because it's very easy to get bleak and overwhelmed. We can look outside, and here we look at the smoke in the air, or you can look at just take your pick, and you can look at any number of ecosystems that are under stress and feel depressed. And so one of the things that I try to emphasize is the importance of also noticing what's not dying, right? What's, springtime, the migrating birds coming back, the bees that are pollinating the flower still, and the rain that's still falling from the sky, and the cumulus clouds that are forming, and the tomatoes that you're growing in your garden, and like just taking joy in the fact that, the earth and nature is profoundly resilient, and there's, even in the midst of the chaos and the crisis and the challenges, there's also beauty, and there's emergence and growth and spring, like, and as I mentioned, like being in northern New Mexico, in Colorado, the wildflowers this year, because it was a good monsoon year, and like, well, let's rejoice in that, even though it's been a 20-year drought in the Southwest. This summer was a good year, and look at how nature rebounds with tremendous resilience just with a few, good weeks of rain. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to beauty, to joy, to nurturing and nourishing that part. Because if we're going to be resilient, and we need to be, this is going to be for the rest of our lives. We're going to be dealing with the climate and ecological crisis. We need to stay, nourished. And we can't just read, bleak data. It's not what inspires us, not what moves us. It's love that moves us, and it's care that moves us. So the more that we can connect with the beauty, and of course, when we connect with beauty, we might also feel sad. We go in, like, I'll hike in Muir Woods, which is a beautiful redwood grove here, and I'll rejoice in just the amazing, 1,000-year-old trees. And I'll also know that 96% of those redwood forests got cut down, and it's holding both, and then rejoicing the fact that these forests remain, and the seeding, with that number, that 4% will grow, because there's a lot of restorative efforts going on. And so that's an important piece. And then there was this lovely Venn diagram that one of the founders, writers, producers of the Project Drawdown, I forget her name, she was the ED of that nonprofit. She had this great, and she's not the only person who's speaking about this, if you imagine three circles, and three circles represent different facets of how we respond to any crisis, but including the one climate crisis. And one is what needs to happen is one. So one circle is what needs to happen, and that might be growing local food. Like I was teaching retreat, and one activist on the last retreat I taught, she said, I live downtown Denver, and one of the most effective things you can do is, if you have a garden anywhere, particularly in a city, is to grow native plants. You say, when you grow native plants, it attracts the native insects, and the insects attract the native birds, and suddenly you create this whole flourishing ecosystem. And if a whole bunch of gardens in that neighborhood suddenly you have a little corridor through the city for birds, and then of course it attracts raptors and it attracts butterflies, and like, we could all plant a few native plants, like, unless you don't have a garden or a yard, So what needs to happen? Growing local food, restoring local ecosystems, right? And we could do that in our own garden. And the second thing is, what's my skill set, right? So for me, what needs to be done is, educate people about the climate crisis, turn people onto the beauty of nature. My skill set is leading wilderness nature stuff, so I do that. But the third thing, which we often forget about, is what brings me joy. And so the confluence of those three circles, the joy, the skill, and the need, is the sweet spot, right? And we often forget about the joy, right? Like, I have friends who work on trying to bring in carbon tax and carbon credit trading, and like, that is really important, but it doesn't excite me, right? Leading people into the woods, that excites me. So, and of course, what brings us joy is going to bring us energy. We're more likely to follow through. We're more likely to continue doing it. And it's going to be contagious. So that's a really helpful way of framing, right? There's plenty of need. We all have skill sets, and then what brings us joy. And so you just reflect for that for yourselves and for your listeners, and then see, well, what wants to happen out of that. And it might be as simple as planting a garden, or it might be getting to know your local farmers, or it might be maybe you care about the politics of your town, and making your little town more sustainable, and so you join the town council, or you make sure you vote for someone who cares about sustainability. And so there's many ways to engage. So that's a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. That was rich. So then, let's say someone doesn't have time and space in their life to do something like, or they're not creating it, but what they do want to create is the connection you were talking about earlier, with their own mind, with their own heart, expanding, just the ability to be present. Can you speak a little bit more about how you feel the connection between, and we're almost at time, I'm just realizing, between when someone, well, the correlation between when you go within yourself, what's the impact on the collective from your perspective? So when we dismantle our conditioning, and we actually, well, not dismantle, because conditioning is just conditioning, but when we see through the illusions of that, and we actually start to open our heart, and we realize, and we're living more from our senses in the presence of our being, how does that impact the collective, do you think?
Yeah, well, we know the individual is not separate from the collective, right? The collective is made up of a lot of, small pieces, beings. And I don't know the answer to the question, to be honest. I just know, you can look back at history, and you look back at when people change either their understanding, their views, their consciousness, and it can be quite a small percentage of the population. It can create significant shifts in the broader population, because we're all connected. Right. So I think of, as for example, we start to wake up to the preciousness of this planet and its incredible intelligence and beauty and complexity. And you could think of the environmental movement as a tiny fraction of the population, right? Really tiny, really, the people who are really engaged and active, but they exert a significant influence. And so I think as we all do our own work, that does inevitably contribute to the whole, but it's kind of mysterious. Yeah. So I think I don't necessarily put my attention there. I put my attention more on how, what we do with our own time and energy, and mostly what I tell people is just get outside, get off your screens, get out of your houses, get out of your cars, get out of your offices. Even just walking around the block, walking around your neighborhood, and if you're lucky, there's a local park, or if you go further, there's a meadow or a woodland, or maybe some stream, and realize that we're part of something bigger, that we're connected, and what affects the stream affects us, and what we put into our bodies affects the trees, and vice versa, and that will inevitably have its impact, and also impact on our own consciousness. And so I think that's one of the imperatives as we become an urban species, we become an indoor species. 95% of our time is now indoors. More than 50% of the human population is in cities. We have to get outdoors to reestablish and rekindle in a very visceral way, sensory way, that connection and love and intimacy, and let nature, inform us, guide us, and it will, if we open ourselves up enough and listen and, put our hands to the earth and our bodies to the earth. So that's our work.
Yeah, what a beautiful image that you just left us with, like hands on the earth, body in the earth. Yeah, take slowing down. And then I think that might be the biggest challenge as a modern day species, is the slowing down and resting. So
Yeah.
that we can listen and feel and hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so is there anything final that you would want to share with listeners about how to learn more about? I mean, I can put your website in the show notes, but anything else you'd want to say about your work, or any message for the whole of people wanting to open their hearts and be in nature?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, aside from just get outside and get off your phones and be quiet, and, and just the longer you're out there, the more it can have an impact. The reason I teach what I teach, the Awaken the Wild work, it's, the book, and there's various meditations both on my website, markcoleman.org, and elsewhere, where, we can draw on those practices, those methodologies, to learn how to bring a more mindful attention, a more sensory awareness, and embodied presence into nature. And that has profound impacts, in terms of our receptivity and openness and love. And so, so feel free, come on an Awaken the Wild retreat. I lead lots of them all over the country, and I run teacher trainings for anybody who's interested in that work. I have now 50 graduates just starting a teacher training next week, which is exciting. And then join the sunrise meditation. You can go to awakenthewild.com and just sign up I'll be starting teaching again in September. Every morning, 7:30 Pacific time. So many ways.
Every morning, Monday through Friday?
Monday through Friday, yeah. It was every morning, but we just went to, it was 7 days a week, but we just went to 5 days a week.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
it is so good to be with you, and I so appreciate what you're doing in the world. I had the privilege of being on a retreat with you in Mexico at Vallecitos, and just seeing and feeling the power of inviting people to go this deep and to be connecting in the natural world. I mean, it's such an important practice and message of just get outside, get off your devices. That's one of my favorite things you said. Put them down and get outside, even if you're walking around the block, and then see what happens. See what you start to notice about yourself and your connection.
Yeah, great. Well, wonderful to be with you too.
You too.